We're moving on to the next level, the middle level of our mix pyramid, which is, of course, the group and bus processing level, as well as the send and return configuration. In the digital domain, it's probably better to refer to this level really as the groups. If you think about an actual analog mixing console, for example, you would actually literally send your tracks to another fader, which requires internal routing, internal cabling, and so forth. And when you go to that additional voltage controlled amplifier, it's imparting a level of saturation, a level of coloration, just by the means of having to transport that signal from point A to point B. And I think bus works better in that context, but grouping really works better in the digital context because that's what we're actually doing. We're just using those ones and zeros. It's all math. No additional coloration is imparted on the sound. We have a perfect replica of the little mini mix that we've created with the tracks within the group. And for that reason, I think using group processing is a much better expression, and it also makes more sense, at least in the digital domain. So from this point onward, everything we're talking about becomes the thinking mixer's game. That's not to say that you haven't been thinking and focusing during production or the early stages of the mix, but at this point, it really becomes about experience, about ear training, and very focused listening, and then thinking about the big picture. Like really the big picture now. What is going to happen when I export this track? What do I want the final result to sound like? And part of the problem here is that this is considered a very major part of the mixing process, but I think it takes years to really hear, and it can take years to really conceptualize and think about what it is you're doing. Just throwing a processor on, putting a preset and saying this sounds louder, it's better, it might work, but it may also be going against the vision that you had for the track to begin with. So what I would tell you is if you're new to mixing music, remember that in the past, the whole idea of becoming a mix engineer involved starting out as an apprentice and kind of just being in the studio and watching your mentor work and setting up things for him and just being a sponge and really trying to absorb everything that's going on around you. You know, sadly, because of like greed, because of fear, mix engineers are really sometimes not going to be sharing what it is they do because they don't want people, quote unquote, stealing their sound. And also just the technology itself and the popularity of mixing, a lot of things moving to the computer, has meant that if you want to get into mixing, you really have to just practice for a few years on your own and start to develop your own techniques without the guide of an experienced mentor. And I think all of us would love to be in that situation, but those jobs just aren't available, and or the people just aren't going to be hiring assistants anymore because you don't need them. You have the computer. It's right there for you, and a lot of the wiring and routing can be done with a very simple like patch bay. So, the times of the past have really changed to the present. But part of the problem with that is that you don't get that discerning ear that maybe you would have otherwise. So if for some reason you're watching these videos and you're not hearing any effect, that could be for a couple of reasons. One is the actual compression on the videos, and so something could be lost in translation there. And the other is you just don't have that ear training. You don't have that really critical ear for mix engineering. And I know it took me a very long time. Like it took me several months to really conceptualize the whole idea of compression. It took me a very long time to even understand it. And then it took me even longer to actually start hearing it. And it was one of those strange things where one day it really did just all click for me and I started to really understand it. And I don't know why it happened like that for me, but that might be the same sort of thing that happens to you. So you just have to practice. You just have to be patient. And remember that if you're not hearing an effect, just leave it out. Don't put on the additional processing just because other people have told you to do so. Eventually, you'll start to hear the need for it. And when that happens, you'll know exactly what to do. All right, so let's actually talk about compression on the groups. So why and how would we apply compression on a group? So these are just a few of the reasons why we might do it. The first one is interesting because it was a problem with early digital and over time has become less and less of an issue, but it has to do with overall mix cohesion. So if you remember back in the days, and maybe if you experimented with making music, 10, 15 years ago in the computer, you would notice that what you were listening to sounded so radically different from the stuff that was on CDs and the stuff that was on radio. And it would really kind of mess with you and bother you. You'd be like, man, this does not sound professional at all. And the reason is that digital is so accurate that you can hear, for example, that different samples do not belong together. So you might hear that, okay, I got this sample from this website. I got this sample from that other website. I'm going to use a couple of built-in ones. And they would never feel like they belong together because of that digital accuracy. Okay. Nowadays, this is where it's interesting. When you buy a sample pack, for example, almost 90% of these sample packs are designed to be ready for production, meaning you drag and drop, you do not process any further. It has been processed for you. And if you stick within the same sample pack, all of them sound very nice together because they've been processed in such a way where they are very cohesive. All right, so when you start pulling from different sample packs, it can then cause some issues. But I think a lot of the manufacturers have realized that sometimes is that mixing X factor, so to speak, that you're missing. And therefore, get the cohesion right from the get-go, and you should be right on your way. But for us, it's possible that we've grabbed samples from all over the place, and by then putting a compressor or really a saturator, any processor on the group, we now are starting to impart some of that analog, quote-unquote, characteristic where everything is running through the same processor, being colored the same way, and it can help to bring things together. And this is why you don't need extreme amounts of gain reduction, unless it's what you're going for, happening at the group level, especially if you're just thinking about cohesion. Also, on the group level, we can get into trimming the peaks, something we've talked about again and again. You could do that for individual samples. You can also do it for the group as a whole. Just be careful that if one part is really the loudest part, that might be the only thing that you're actually trimming. And that's okay, but you just want to be made aware of that so that you're not then over compressing the peak or over limiting the peak. Also here we have add more bounce, something that we just talked about before. You can do it on individual parts, and it commonly is also done on the group level as well. And then a final question that's really important to ask is, will I be processing in parallel as well? And this is pretty specific to parts like drums, or if you have a lot of guitars, but it's a consideration that you have to be made aware of from the beginning because it will ultimately influence the settings of the group level compressor that you have. So the controls on a compressor that are fundamentally what I would say responsible for changing the characteristic are the attack and release times. Because when it comes to compression, as we've talked about before, it's really all about movement. Okay, how is it responding? How is it releasing? Etc., etc. And that's really what determines the style of the compression for whether or not it's going to be limiting those peaks or if you're going to be adding in more bounce. You can do additional things with it as well, but those are kind of the two biggie ones. So if we will also be applying compression in parallel, will that influence the settings for the compressor on the group? And it absolutely will, because if we're going with a parallel compression where we're doing a crush, and we'll talk about this, then there's no reason for us to be limiting the peaks on the group. It's just going to end up taking away from the purpose of using that parallel compressor. And we will talk about that. So thus, how do we plan to set up the parallel compressor? Are we going to go for a bounce with it, or are we going for a crush with it? And that then dictates how you set the compressor on the group level. Trust me, this will make so much more sense when we go into the example. So another question that a lot of people have at this point is, which compressor should I use for the bus? And oh my gosh, if I had a nickel for every time that question was asked, or every time that argument is started, or every time a magazine puts out that propaganda piece, I would have enough nickels to buy, one of those rack pieces that we looked at before. There are a lot of compressors to choose from on the market, and most of them do claim to be suitable for bus or group use. Others are designed and marketed specifically for use on the bus. So what are we supposed to believe? What are we supposed to go with? And really, at the end of the day, it's about application. So are we trying to crush it? Are we trying to add more bounce, add more movement? What are we really doing? It's about application and the source material that you feed in. What group of instruments are you compressing? And that is what's going to help you determine which compressor to use. There's not going to be one that's just fundamentally the best. Sometimes the built-in stock compressor with your DAW is what works the best. Sometimes the really clean stuff works great. Sometimes the more quote unquote character compressors work great. It just all depends. And when thinking purely about cohesion, like I mentioned before, the amount of gain reduction really should be minimal here. So just because that compressor can be used to slam a signal and get tons of gain reduction doesn't mean that you have to do that, especially if you're thinking in terms of cohesion. So what you have to do in terms of choosing a compressor for the group level is to experiment. Okay, use what you have access to, listen to how it reacts, and sometimes you might have to try all four and then just pick what you prefer. And it's really quite that simple, I think. And what I would tell you is don't break the bank on 30 different compressors when the differences that you're hearing between them are very subtle. The average listener, and I always come back to this point, maybe if you talk amongst audiophiles and other engineers, they'll really hear that difference and they'll really whine and complain about your choice. But the average listener does not care at all. This is why you want to make sure you're hearing an effect. Because if, for example, you are unable to hear that effect, what are the odds of the listener hearing it? And that's really the question that you have to ask yourself. That's what's most important here, not spending $8,000 on a bunch of compressors when you could spend that $8,000 on a lot of different sounds to be used that every listener can very easily pick up on. So, I have my pet peeves about that. I guess it's because I do come from more of a production mindset and background. Might be the reason why I get so hostile about this. But again, just my opinion. And I do believe that what you have already and what you're going to have access to here in this course is more than enough options to find something that works. And the other question, and the final question here before we go to the example, is which groups do I actually want to then apply compression to? And really, it's up to you, and there is no rule or limit about what you should and shouldn't group compress. It's about using your ears. It's about thinking big picture, being the thinking mix engineer, so to speak. But typically, these are the groups that you may consider and that are popularly go through group compression for a variety of reasons. Drums by far being the biggest, thus it's in all caps. So not only digital samples, but even analog kits, because you have so many different tracks, maybe a variety of different microphones have been used. Using that group compression can really help to cohesively bring things together, and it could then also be used to add additional bounce. So if the drums are the rhythmic and moving force within that track, you want to have some additional bounce so that people want to stay on the dance floor, or just to make it interesting, whatever. With synthesizers, oftentimes we think about group compression in a very limited and kind of minimal usage. So more so for cohesion, because if you have some digital synthesizers, some analog synthesizers, they may not sound like they necessarily fit together. And I told you before, every synth has its own kind of sonic footprint. And that's a good thing, but you also want to bring that in to make it sound as if everything is going through the same kind of processor. It's a really big component in making a mix kind of, work, for lack of a better term. And I think here too, what's important to remember is that you don't need a ton of gain reduction. It can be very minimal because you can always go back to the individual tracks and add that additional compression for whatever reason, or just go back to the audio envelope itself, the ADSR envelopes for both the amplitude or the filter, and adjust it to taste if you need more or less pop. All right, it's pretty easy and straightforward, especially if you come from a background of working with synthesizers and envelopes. You understand that what compression is doing is very similar to the envelope shaping that you are setting from those controls. Sometimes it needs a little bit more, and sometimes it doesn't. Background vocals, commonly here, you're going to compress them all pretty tightly on the group level, but you're probably not going to add that same amount of compression to the lead vocal. All right, the lead vocal is going to stand out. It's going to have its own unique processing, but background vocals commonly are compressed pretty hard, and that's another commonplace for the group level. You don't even necessarily have to process each of those background vocals individually with compression. You can do it as a group. And then also guitars, and with guitars, it can be done for both the compression purposes, limiting dynamic range, adding more movement, or also for cohesion if you have 5 or 6 different guitars all fighting. And in a digital context, this is a little bit more common. If you're using different sample packs or you're using different multi-sampled instruments, like in the one mix that you're going to have access to, there are a variety of different guitar sounds, and they probably should all be compressed together despite them sounding very different. All right, so we're going to jump in here, do a quick example with this, and hopefully then these concepts will make a lot more sense to you. So for this example, we're going to be working with a drums group, mainly because this is the most common area in a mix that you will be applying group compression to. And it's really all about listening and making that determination on your own as to what you do want to process on the group level and what you don't want to process on the group level. If your mix sounds fine without doing any drum group processing, absolutely don't do it. But what we're going to do is just walk through the kind of steps and the reasoning as to why we may or may not want to go with some kind of group processing. And remember, I could go in here to the individual tracks and apply processing as well. In this example, I haven't done that, but let's just listen to what we're working with. Okay, so there's a couple of things right off the bat. Number one, when I made this last night, I was surprised at how cohesive this sounds to begin with. It doesn't seem like these samples are all coming from very different places, and for that reason, I can conclude that that probably has to do with picking all of the samples from the exact same sample pack, the 99 drum samples, despite the fact that they're named, kind of in different categories, like they have acoustic, and then they have sometimes like 808, and I used a pretty nice variety, but they still sound like they all kind of belong together, which I'm very happy about. It means I don't have to really think too hard about cohesion because it sounds pretty cohesive to begin with. The other thing is, whenever I do program drums, I'm very conscious of the varying dynamics that I put in. So probably on all of these parts, nothing is consistent all the way across. Like there's always some variation. If we look at these drums, you can see this is at -4. This next one here is at -5. Back to -4, and then at -6. So you're hearing additional bounce being brought into this just courtesy of the varying, like, quote unquote, velocities or just the varying levels on each and every part here. So one more time. So never underestimate what can be accomplished without processing. Just like thinking at the production stage, what can I do to add more movement, give it more of a groove? And I'd say this has a pretty nice kind of groove to it. But if we wanted to go through then and apply additional compression on the group as a whole, we might do it to try and, limit the dynamic range and actually make this louder. Okay, and if I was to do that, I would be telling myself I am not going to be doing any sort of parallel compression. I want to make this thing louder. I just want to bring it up. I want to make it more powerful. I don't necessarily want to change the maximum output here. But on the whole, on the average, I want it to sound louder. So the way I would go about doing that is, through a variety of methods. We're going to use a new processor here, but let's start with that new processor, actually. It's the DCAM FreeComp. It's supposed to be, one of 100 emulations of the SSL bus compressor, very commonly used on the master bus, also very commonly used on drums. And if you don't believe me, you actually have heard the real unit probably 100, 200 times when virtually every record was being made on an SSL console. So you've heard it 100 times before, and you'll probably hear it 100 times again now that it's been given a new life in plugin format. All right, so first I want to actually just look at the dB out here, and I want to check and see where we are without applying any compression. So I need to take my threshold here and just boost it all the way to the top so we can see no gain reduction. Okay. We're at a pretty good level. I think that we can work with that. If you're really low, you're going to want to bring it up because you want to maximize the efficiency of this compressor. You don't want to have the threshold all the way down to get gain reduction. And in fact, I might bring this in even by 1 dB or so. So if we're thinking about trimming peaks, We can think of this in two ways. One would be to try to use the compressor to do that. And so I'll take the attack time and I'll put it down to 0.1, the slowest time. We'll turn gain reduction on. We'll bring down the threshold to start to get some gain reduction. And then I can choose just how extreme I want this to be with the ratio. And this is already a decent amount, I think, because you can see how much we've brought down the signal. Within this compressor, there's a built-in release that reacts to the signal that comes in. So again, like we talked about before, multi-stage release, I think when it gets a transient, it goes back quick, and then it kind of slowly starts to come down after that. All right, so that's the idea with the multi-stage release. You don't have to worry about it, but that's a really big factor and one of the major differences between compressors that are available in both hardware and software form. So now we'll just apply some makeup gain. Get back to where we were. And we can listen to the before and after. So really, this isn't very exciting. It has brought things in a little bit, but I would say on the whole, I don't know. I don't think this would work very well in the relationship with the rest of the mix. So I might try a little bit of a different strategy, which is going to be to use two processors. One is going to be the peak limiter to really focus on the peaks, and then I might use this compressor to just add a little bit more bounce. And so to do that, I'm going to just use that attack to let more and more of the transient sneak through. Get a little more compression going. We can try the 4 ratio. Again, I just want to check our meters here to try to level match this. Okay, so I can probably use maybe 2 dB or so more. So here's the original, and here's with the more bounce. So that sounds pretty good, and then if I want, I can go in and do a little bit of peak limiting by using the loud max. And since this is peaking out at around -2, I don't want to really add in too much more gain. We'll just bring it down to about here. Maybe trim these peaks by an additional 2 dB or so. And now I'll be able to hear the difference. And here, if we were to take this DCAM FreeComp and put it back to the really fast attack time, it would really, I think, hurt the overall quality of this because it's as if we are compressing the peaks twice, which isn't what we want to do here. We're using the loud max to grab the peaks, and we're using this compressor to actually get more movement beyond that peak level, beyond that initial transient, to give it more movement, to give it more bounce. So let's just listen to what happens when we do that. You hear how much energy we've lost? And also we're applying a lot more compression. So that would be one method to applying a group level compressor on the drums to try to give it not only more movement, but to also limit the dynamic range when we're not going to be working with a parallel compressor. If we are going to be working with a parallel compressor, then I might leave this DCAM FreeComp with the settings it has, but I would take off the loud max, which is going to be a really big part of what happens with my drum crush, which we'll be looking at in the next video. But again, we can use different compressors on here. So if we want, we could try to go back and we could actually use here the FRComp 87. If you're listening to the before and after there, I feel very strongly that the DCAM FreeComp would work better with this actual drum beat. And then we can go back and we can try, for example, something from our mix tools. Why don't we go in here and use the M-Juice? Let's see how that sounds on this drum beat. Let's first try fast. Actually, let's use slow. We would more likely use slow in this example if we are planning to use a parallel compressor. So we're using this for just additional bounce. So maybe 2 dB or so of gain reduction. Let's try auto. That compresses it a lot heavier. And so one of the issues with the M-Juice is just how it completely takes away the low end. All right, so the sub of that kick drum is really taken away by this M-Juice. And for that reason, I probably wouldn't use this for my drums processor either. And again, it's all about context and figuring out what you need and what you're going for. On some styles of music, this might work really well as a cohesive force. For this particular loop, I'm going to say it doesn't really work. Let's go in and let's try the Kotelnikov. It's really not used for this purpose, but, you know, let's give it a whirl and see what happens here. We also do have that stereo differential, which is useful. Okay, I'm going to try to get about 3 dB or so. Long attack, let it bounce through. And you can see that with the super long attack time, we're not even utilizing this release peak at all. That light is not coming on. So getting that extra movement, getting that extra shoot back is going to be coming from the release RMS, which we'll put down to be really fast here. And then let's check and see how much gain we're losing. Okay, it's around -4. I think this comes out to around -2 or so. No, -3.5. Okay, so we'll add a little bit of makeup gain. And then the really nice thing about this particular compressor is that we have this low frequency relax. So the beauty of that is that we can put in this slope here and we can change this to like 12 dB. And so now it's not going to be reacting to that low end as much. So that low end is going to be able to keep booming out. It's not going to compress that. Oh yeah, you can hear that. Then we can set where we want that frequency to start. Oh yeah. So you can hear for this style of music, a dance music like this, having something like a low frequency relaxed control, sometimes they just call it a sidechain filter, huge advantage. And for this reason, this would probably be the compressor I would use, even though it is called a mastering compressor. I don't know, it seems to sound pretty dang good on this. And again, it's just all about context. So that's what it comes down to. And that's how you're going to have to use your ears. So again, this is an application more so for just adding additional bounce, getting more movement into it. And in the next video, we're going to talk about doubling this up in a way and going with a parallel compression, which is going to add more body and overall loudness. All right, so look forward to that.